Andrew sat at his kitchen table, shuffling a stack of unpaid bills, each envelope heavy with accusation. The clatter of his children upstairs only deepened the quiet dread pooling in his chest. Behind the factory walls he'd built from nothing, creditors whispered about insolvency and started calling at all hours. He felt the familiar sting of fear nestle into his thoughts, gnawing away at the confidence that once carried him from the Mississippi mud to the docks of New Orleans. Every corner he turned, bank, supplier, even the local grocer, someone seemed to be waiting, palm open, asking for money he simply did not have. He was not alone at that table. His wife sat across from him, reading the worry lines on his brow as if trying to decipher a secret code. Their voices grew lower each evening, heavy with questions that felt unanswerable. Can we really keep the lights on another month? What if the kids need new shoes? One faulty piece of equipment was enough to halt production for a week, and Andrew watched his workers with a growing sense of helplessness, feeling responsible not just for his family, but for every paycheck that depended on his clattering assembly lines. Yet beneath this landscape of struggle, something else edged into his awareness, a dull throb of stubborn hope. It flickered in memories of better days, the childlike pride he once felt examining a newly finished boat, the camaraderie of late-night problem-solving in the workshop with grease-stained hands, and a shared sense of possibility. Even as debts mounted, there was an undeniable pull to keep moving, to search restlessly for the crack in the wall that might let the light back in. But hope, he knew, was not a plan. Each time he allowed himself a rare moment to dream, reality snapped him back with another notice stamped urgent. The desperation was almost tangible, a weight pressing in on his chest, making each breath harder. Now, imagine you are Andrew Higgins, or perhaps closer to your own reality. You are the one sorting through bills on a kitchen table late at night, the room lit only by the yellow glow of a single lamp. Maybe your mailbox is filling up with reminders, not for grand sums, but just enough to feel like you're always running uphill. Maybe you've stood in line at the bank, rehearsing what to say when an overdue payment is mentioned, or lain awake calculating how many more weeks you can stretch what little remains in your account. The world keeps moving on the outside, people rushing, businesses posting profits, a constant hum of success flashing on social media feeds. But inside your four walls, time moves differently. Minutes stretch as you replay conversations, try to piece together another solution, and silently ask yourself, will it ever turn around? In the nights when anxiety whispers, your mind circles the same worn-out questions. Why did it get this bad? Did you make the wrong decision somewhere along the line? Is it too late to try something new? That gnawing fear that if you stumble just once more, everything you've tried to build could topple. It's a feeling few speak openly about, a sense of being stuck, of watching your options fall away, of being defined by your debts rather than your dreams. Yet there is another reality, just beneath that tension, the quiet certainty that if you could only see past the fear, you might uncover something unexpected and deeply valuable. Maybe, without even realizing it, your circumstances are nudging you toward an opportunity you haven't yet noticed. It's this moment, raw with uncertainty, where the greatest financial transformations begin, not in grand revelations, but in the silent reckoning between what is and what could be, between the echo of panic and the possibility of something different. The question is not just how you got here, but what you might discover if you allow yourself to look at your situation with new eyes. Beneath the surface of crisis, there is a kernel of potential waiting quietly. The story of Andrew Higgins isn't just about war and invention. It is about the invisible line between despair and innovation, one that can be crossed when necessity demands it. Tonight you may feel isolated in your struggle, but history's innovators have walked this path before you, feeling just as uncertain, just as weary, and just as surrounded by apparent impossibility. What if the turning point you need is hidden, not beyond your reach, but just beyond the edge of your current perspective? This is not just a story of survival. It is the first flicker of a different way of being with money, even if tonight that truth is barely visible through the fog. Let's step closer. As Andrew's world spun faster beneath the strain, flashes of his upbringing darted through his mind, a patchwork of moments stitched together by the steady, relentless thread of scarcity. He remembered, vividly, his father lingering by the stove on winter mornings, hands tucked deep into frayed pockets, repeating the same phrase. We make do with what we have. The mantra seeped into Andrew's bones long before he'd ever signed a loan or negotiated wages, an invisible inheritance wrapped in caution. Even now, with his own children asleep on the other side of a paper-thin door, that well-worn maxim echoed. Yet, the landscape around him had shifted. Where his childhood home had been shaped by the rules of survival, with every luxury deemed excessive, now the stakes felt grander, the necessary choices sharper. Each financial decision seemed to draw on a reservoir of beliefs laid down in those early years, beliefs that had quietly become his compass, guiding him even when he wasn't fully aware of it. Instead of seeing the ledgers simply as numbers and obligations, Andrew began, almost involuntarily, to trace their shape back through time. Late at night, alone in his office, he found himself wondering why the sight of debt did not just provoke anxiety, but a deep, almost paralyzing shame. It was as if the weight he carried was not just about the money owed, but about betraying some ancestral code. Never owe, never want, never risk more than you can bear. Layered behind these silent rules were the histories of those who came before him. He could picture his grandmother smoothing flour over a counter, carefully pinching coins from a ceramic jar, insisting that a penny saved is a penny earned. She taught him thrift, but also a fear of loss so potent it sometimes stifled any impulse to reach for something more. The message was simple: be grateful, but don't expect abundance. Not for people like us. Furthermore, the messages didn't just come from within four walls. Peers at the local shop, neighbors at church, the muffled conversations between adults as they traded rumors of whose business was closing next. These moments shaped a collective understanding of what was safe, what was prudent, and what could never be spoken of aloud. Prosperity, in whispers, was usually attributed to luck or danger, not skill or vision. As Andrew grew older and tried to carve out a place for himself, he realized how many of his reactions to risk and reward were inherited, not deliberate. Building from these realizations, he began to sense how the world at large writes scripts about money, scripts we rarely question. Advertising promised unending comfort and ease. Yet every film hero seemed to be either extravagantly rich or gloriously poor and noble in suffering. The messages tangled, making it nearly impossible to separate wisdom from caution, ambition from greed. Andrew realized that, despite his daily struggle for solvency and security, some part of him feared the consequences of true success just as much as the specter of failure. Curiously, these unspoken instructions weren't only anchored in the past or mainstream culture. Even his dreams contained the fingerprints of his background. What should he want? And what must he avoid? Whenever a bold idea sparked, a new design or daring pitch, he could feel the ghostly pull of old warnings. Don't get too big for your britches. The silent suspicion that thriving financially might come at the expense of moral character had burrowed deep. Confronted with this knowledge, Andrew stood at a unique intersection. The scripts he'd absorbed in childhood, mingled with those drifting through the wider world, had quietly laid out boundaries, invisible yet binding, for what was possible, safe, or desirable. Realizing this, for the first time, offered an unexpected aperture through which to glimpse an alternative. Instead of moving through life on autopilot, governed by rules he'd never chosen, he now felt the quiet beginnings of awareness, an invitation to question whose voice was really setting the limits. Reflecting in the pale morning light at his workbench, hands calloused and head tired, Andrew understood that his responses, to risk, to debt, to possibility, were shaped less by facts and more by a complex dance of memory and expectation. This understanding did not magically wipe away his challenges or hand him a solution, but it gave his struggle new context. He felt a flicker of curiosity. If these beliefs were not his own, could he choose differently? The door to freedom stood ajar, waiting for him to decide which stories he would carry forward and which he might finally set down. A brisk morning wind rattled the warped windows of Andrew's office, bringing with it the restless energy of a world pushing past the boundaries of comfort. Over the hum of distant machinery, a single pencil rolled across his cluttered desk and fell to the floor with a thunk, almost as if nudging him from his daze. He glanced up, the blueprint before him blurred by the fog of exhaustion. And, recently, a growing fire of defiance. Just days ago, while pulling a tarp over a half-finished hull, he'd overheard two of his men discussing what seemed like a rumor, yet sparked something electric in his chest. Heard they're looking for a landing craft. One whispered, not quite believing the possibilities in his own words. Something that can get soldiers right onto a beach, fast. Andrew's mind snapped to attention with the clarity of ice water. Here was a concrete challenge tailor-made for his brand of stubborn ingenuity, one that nobody else seemed willing to chase down. He scribbled furiously into his notebook, chasing after a design so simple it bordered on reckless. Still, whispers of doubt crowded in around him. Who was he to think he could solve a problem that had stumped experienced engineers? The dockworker's skepticism, laced with hollow laughter, clung to him as he moved through the shop. Even his own foreman, usually a font of can-do spirit, fronted him quietly with, "Boss, are you sure about this? We can't afford to waste what little's left." This anxiety, far from scaring him off, ignited within Andrew a deep, devil-may-care determination. Yet, alongside the burn of challenge lay traps. In the deepest corners of his mind, financial myths prowled with magnetic force. He'd always believed, like most folks in the city, that opportunity only smiled on those with overflowing bank accounts or family names spelled out on brass plaques. The unspoken creed was that innovation belonged to a rarefied class, while folks like him kept their ambitions lashed tightly to survival. But in the silent space of his workshop, he began poking holes in this logic, letting air and light twist through outdated assumptions. Andrew soon realized that most financial truisms he'd clung to didn't hold up under scrutiny. The myth that only plenty breeds possibility began to unravel as he consulted with a grizzled machinist named Ellis. One afternoon, the two stood shoulder to shoulder by an old lathe, the air rich with the scent of oil and burnt sawdust. "Look, Drew," Ellis said, wiping his hands on a rag. "If money solved everything, the richest men would be the only ones inventing. But it's the hungry ones who wind up hungry for more." That seed planted itself firmly, and with each passing hour, Andrew took greater pleasure in dismantling yet another threadbare belief. He started compiling a list of affirmations, not the kind found in dime store pamphlets, but forged from the heat of practical experiment. "Resourcefulness," he would mutter quietly, shuffling through salvaged parts, "trumps resources every time." Before long, he outlined a mantra for his workers: "Problems are questions the world hasn't answered yet." Each time a welder hesitated at strange angles or a mechanic balked at a novel propeller, he gently pushed them to see constraints not as brick walls, but as scaffolds for original thinking. Consequently, the environment in his workshop shifted. Cautious glances were replaced by a new humility, a willingness to test the unlikely, champion the incomplete, and trust the value of persistence over pedigree. Simple innovations, like a ramp at the hull's bow or a shallow draft bottom, emerged not because they seemed safe, but because the specter of failure demanded boldness. One evening, as sunset flooded the riverbank, he watched from the shadows and saw, for the first time, his team inching closer toward ownership of these ideas. The hush of disbelief began to fray. Now, imagine yourself in this narrative, standing over your proverbial blueprint. Instead of waiting for all conditions to be perfect, you begin poking and prodding at your own limiting beliefs, challenging the notion that you must have more experience, more credentials, more backing before you can take meaningful risks. When you recognize that many financial myths are simply old ghosts echoing outdated fears, you grant yourself the freedom to experiment. Small, daring changes, like pitching an idea you once dismissed or negotiating terms you thought fixed, become not acts of hubris, but sparks that set your next chapter ablaze. As Andrew's outlandish designs steadily took form on the shop floor, he realized that real breakthroughs are rarely blessed by comfort. They are scrappy, forged by necessity, and empowered by the rejection of myths that chain potential to the past. The distance between lack and abundance, he now saw, need only be crossed by one brave decision, or perhaps by the persistent repetition of many small, courageous choices stitched together. The fabric of enterprise, he discovered, is more patchwork than perfection, and freedom, pushing past doubts and dogma, waits right there, on the other side of a broken rule. By late July, Thunderheads rolled over the Mississippi, spitting rain onto the cracked pavement as Andrew ducked beneath the industrial awning, pocketing his notebook. Inside the plant, the atmosphere pulsed with new tension as, for the first time in weeks, workers moved not out of routine, but from a sense of fraught anticipation. An unspoken agreement crackled among them. This was a test that demanded more than mechanics, more than guts. In those moments, it was not enough to possess an idea. Something deeper had to shift within each person who hoped for transformation. While metal clanged and welders sent sparks dancing across the gloom, Andrew paused to catch his breath near the galley, where the apprentice, Calvin, scuffed his boots along the concrete. "They say the army's coming through tomorrow," Calvin ventured, voice low. "Are we really ready?" The question echoed through the plant, a mirror of every internal doubt crowding each worker's mind. Andrew kneeled to help Calvin gather dropped bolts, not offering easy reassurances, but meeting the vulnerability head-on. "You know, Calvin," he said, dusting off his hands, "readiness isn't just equipment, it's expectation. If we expect ourselves to merely scrape by, that's all we'll ever do. But if we expect to prove something, maybe even surprise ourselves, then suddenly, the impossible seems just a bit less out of reach." The boy nodded, the seed of a new attitude quietly taking root where before only worry had grown. Rather than waiting for external validation, those in the shop began experimenting with tangible shifts in their daily rhythms. A seasoned machinist, Ruth, tacked a blank ledger onto a corkboard. Each evening, the crew gathered briefly to jot down a single sentence about what went right, no matter how minor. This small act of giving gratitude, so simple it might be overlooked, changed the collective air inside the shop. Gradually, the atmosphere shifted from complaint to curiosity. New solutions seemed to arrive on the heels of appreciation. A stubborn valve fixed after someone acknowledged another's extra effort. A dented hull panel reimagined as a template for a ramp. Moving forward, visualization became another quiet revolution. At sunrise, Andrew took time alone in the storage yard, closing his eyes while the croak of distant cranes mingled with the river breeze. He pictured not only the completed boats but the moment when soldiers, safe, alive, would set foot on foreign sand. This mental rehearsal, far from mere fantasy, fine-tuned his focus. When faced with setbacks later in the day, late deliveries, misfit parts, he found himself less rattled, more curious. Tools, when mislaid, were now found with less irritation and more intention, as if the entire factory flowed with a different current. Notably, these mindset shifts rippled from internal practice into outward habits. Ruth, whose home life was consumed by the pressures of rationing, began journaling her expenses and hunches about resourceful substitutions. Tracking small expenditures with calm, noting the satisfaction of a penny saved or a clever trade, she saw patterns emerge. A leaky bucket could be patched, a frayed cable reused. In sharing her journals with a neighbor, Ruth unknowingly sparked a small network of mutual support. What began as private reflection quickly transformed into practical collaboration, reinforcing new attitudes through concrete, visible outcomes. Simultaneously, Andrew recognized the emerging link between internal discipline and practical, everyday victories. He instituted silent quarters each Tuesday, 1 hour where all staff, instead of speaking, worked in quiet, using the time to reflect on their intentions for the week. This exercise heightened senses and awareness, resulting in fewer errors and a subtle, shared sense of commitment to quality. Rather than reacting to financial stress with frantic effort, the team learned to move thoughtfully, investing each gesture with meaning. Soon, suppliers commented on improved order accuracy and faster turnaround. Direct results built upon these modest internal shifts. Finally, these new practices glimpsed a world of possibility beyond the plant walls. On payday, Calvin, who just months ago worried aloud about his future, guided a discussion with friends at a downtown cafe. They swapped stories, encouragement, and even pooled cash to help one another weather tight weeks. In this way, outlooks shifted from isolation and anxiety to one of community resilience, with every participant finding themselves more prepared to face uncertainty with both creativity and solidarity. The journey in Andrew's plant was proof that the foundation for financial change is not built on sweeping gestures, but on the quiet consistency of intention. Under the hard light of necessity, the link between thought and deed revealed itself as unmistakable. The more deliberately you nurture a new mindset, the more quickly your reality begins to change in its image. The day the contract was greenlit, an air of quiet yet deliberate confidence settled over Andrew's features, as if he was waking up to another layer of himself previously unknown. There was a lightness in his steps, the kind that comes not from relief but from the internal click of stepping into one's own shoes for the very first time. The shop itself seemed to pulse with fresh energy. Workers who once stole nervous glances at him now greeted him with something akin to pride, as if their collective fortunes had pivoted on a secret they were finally ready to embrace. That afternoon, Andrew retreated to the riverside, letting the muffled echoes of hammer blows fade behind him. Alone, he traced the rippling water with his eyes, mind whirring with possibilities beyond paychecks or balance sheets. He wasn't just the sum of his debts or the architect of a single invention anymore. As he stood in that moment, the boundary between crisis and capacity began to dissolve, replaced by something more powerful, a budding sense of identity not defined by his struggles, but by the meaning he could shape from them. Not long after, a young reporter arrived, eager to tell the story of Higgins' miracle craft. She arrived with a pad brimming with questions about specs and statistics, but Andrew steered the conversation elsewhere, his answers tinged with something deeper. "Money's never just about coin or paper," he began, leaning back against the hull. "It's about what you decide it stands for. For me, every dollar my company earns now feels like a promise kept, to my family, to the kids working the lines, and to every soldier who counts on these boats to bring him home." His words didn't dress up struggle as heroism, nor did they prettify the scars of sacrifice. Instead, imbued in his tone was the realization that financial empowerment rested as much in the choices he made daily as in the contracts he secured or the zeros he inked on a ledger. His employees noticed the shift as well, not just in him, but in themselves. Take Charlotte, a single mother who had feared layoffs for months. As she walked her son to school, he tugged on her sleeve, asking why she seemed taller lately. With an uncertain laugh, Charlotte knelt beside him. "I think I just know now that we're going to be okay, and that I had a hand in it." That subtle transformation, from victim of circumstances to participant in possibility, was contagious. The narrative inside her home evolved. Dinner table conversations stopped circling around what they couldn't afford and wandered instead toward how they might use this season to set down the groundwork for dreams that had been postponed for too long. This evolving sense of financial identity didn't manifest as blind optimism. It surfaced in the smallest, almost invisible ways. In the steadier handshake Andrew offered creditors, now partners rather than adversaries. In Ruth's decision to voice new process improvements without apology, trusting that her contribution deserved the spotlight. Moreover, it colored the way each individual viewed setbacks, reframing them as ground for experimentation rather than evidence of inadequacy. Where shame had once dictated silence, now there was room for curiosity, and, surprisingly, laughter amid the inevitable setbacks. The tide of self-respect brought with it a reimagined sense of ethics and mutual purpose. Charlotte, spurred by her own shift, proposed the team begin volunteering once a month at a local shelter, a simple act that reminded everyone prosperity reaches its peak meaning when shared. Meanwhile, Andrew found himself encouraging open-book discussions with employees, a radical step in transparency that tethered profit not just to output, but to shared progress and dignity. By aligning the pursuit of prosperity with a sense of responsibility to the wider world, Andrew's company evolved into more than a paycheck generator. It became a proving ground for a new definition of what it meant to be truly wealthy. Not just in dollars, but in the assurance that every financial choice radiated outward, touching not only personal lives, but the fabric of the wider community as well. As the sun set behind the factory's smokestack, casting meandering shadows over heaps of steel and sawdust, there grew an unspoken understanding within those walls. True abundance wasn't something to be won at all costs, but a byproduct of living one's values out loud. Now, Imagine the seismic difference if every decision you made with money sprang not from fear or habit, but from the deep well of who you are and what you want to give the world, moving from survival to stewardship, from scarcity to a legacy unbounded by circumstance. Each weekday morning, the old bell rang in the foyer of Mary's consignment shop, and with it came customers carrying everything from antique mirror frames to baby clothes, all eager to barter for a handful of dollars. For years, Mary ran her business on autopilot, convinced that the industry's rules were as fixed as the glass display cases lining her front window. There was a comfort in the predictability, but also a nagging inertia. Under the surface of her routine, she sensed unexplored possibilities flickering just beyond her field of vision. One stormy Tuesday topped her patience. Rain battered the glass, and foot traffic slowed to a trickle. Mary found herself rearranging a shelf she'd already dusted twice, when a teenage girl ducked in, dripping and cradling a box of worn comic books. Hesitant, the girl shared that these were her late brother's most treasured items, and she hoped to trade them, not for money, but for help creating a small memorial in the corner. Something about the encounter snapped Mary out of rote habit. There was a human value here that transcended simple transaction. Instead of refusing or sticking to her usual buy-sell pattern, Mary closed the distance with a question. If we do this, what story do you want people to hear? The conversation that followed opened a new window in Mary's mind. What if scarcity wasn't only a matter of numbers, but of vision? That afternoon, energized by the idea, Mary hosted a small event in her shop, inviting others who'd lost loved ones to share their keepsakes and stories. Strangely, the more she facilitated exchanges around meaning rather than cash, the more foot traffic flourished in the following weeks. Her regular accountant was baffled as sales spiked. However, Mary noticed an even richer form of growth, one that grew from cultivating networks of reciprocity and shared purpose. A shift in Mary's self-perception followed. She stopped defining herself strictly as a shopkeeper, a seller of second chances, and started asking how her intuition and care might shape a new kind of community hub, one that saw people as partners in growth rather than mere consumers. This subtle change in self-concept rippled outwards. Her staff, once disengaged and inclined to clockwatch, began suggesting side projects, from art nights to swap meets. More importantly, Mary found herself responding to pricing setbacks with a sense of resourcefulness rather than panic. When a shipment of designer goods failed to arrive, she called her network and organized a local artist's pop-up, bridging the revenue gap with creativity instead of despair. For Mary's regulars, these innovations sparked a cascade of changes in their perception, too. Regulars started to view the shop as a place of possibility, not just transactions. They shared word-of-mouth testimonies, returned with friends, and even donated higher-quality items, sensing their investment would multiply far beyond dollars. Through these ripples, Mary became less reactive to negative trends. Her measure of success evolved from simply tallying sales to tracking stories told and partnerships born. As autumn colored the maples in the town square, Mary's own sense of purpose and worth deepened. She realized that prosperity could be mapped not in isolation, but through the intricate lines connecting her to those her shop touched. When a reporter visited to cover her monthly memory exchange event, Mary offered tea by the old register. "This place looks different because we started asking different questions," she explained. "What value lives between the cracks of what people bring in? How can we turn uncertainty itself into the fuel for belonging and new beginnings?" Looking at the window, where passers-by pressed hands to the pane just to get a glimpse of new displays, Mary took a full, unhurried breath. She saw herself less as a manager of risk and more as a steward of transformation. The old, worn-out map of scarcity faded further into the background, replaced by a living tapestry, a testament to how new identity and redefined purpose could shape not just the bottom line, but the very soul of a business and the community it serves. Reflecting on this journey so far, one senses a subtle yet profound undercurrent, something that reveals itself only when the noise of everyday urgency falls away. It feels almost as though you are standing at the edge of a deep forest, eyes adjusted to the shifting light, feeling your way forward along a path both familiar and newly unknown. There, between the trees, past footprints begin to dissolve into the soft earth, while the whisper of wind hints at the quiet possibility that the route ahead might be more forgiving than the road behind. In such a space, certainty becomes less about what you grip tightly in your hands and more about the trust you place in each measured step. If you listen closely, you might notice the syncopated rhythm of self-doubt and hope, each advancing stride echoing countless choices made without a script, each pause heavy with the significance of unsaid dreams. The world, which once presented itself as an endless ledger of costs and gains, now shimmers with intangible connections, moments of insight, simple thanks exchanged after a long day, the faint glimmer of hope at the end of a risk. Along the riverbank of this transformation, the air crackles with anticipation. Characters who seem defined by their struggle begin to move differently, their actions guided not by the shadows of yesterday's fears, but by something more luminous, harder to name. It's a subtle shift, almost like the moment when early morning mist gives way to sunbeams, leaving everything touched by a fresher clarity. In these gentle transitions, you begin to sense the presence of a new, sturdier foundation, one that does not demand certainty, but rewards mindful participation and quiet courage. The conversations along this journey take on a different tone now, as if each interaction is now suffused with purpose. You find yourself drawn into a dialogue not just with others, but with your own evolving narrative. The questions that once chased you in circles, how much is enough? What if I fail? Do I deserve this? Are replaced by a curiosity that sounds far less like interrogation and more like an invitation to explore. Where there once was a tightness around possibility, there now trickles a cautious delight, the tentative joy that comes from glimpsing your own capacity in the small acts of persistence and reinvention that you barely noticed at first. The pace of life inside this new season has shifted, too. There's a quality to the days, a sense that, rather than bouncing from crisis to crisis, you are slowly constructing something whole. Fragments of old patterns begin to relinquish their hold, making space for fresh endeavors unencumbered by the silent weight of shame or old debts. You witness this in the way hands move over familiar tasks with just a little more intention, in the willingness to reach out to the person beside you, or to dare ask for what you need as if the world might, this time, answer with kindness. This confluence of internal and external movement resembles the slow opening of a flower, each petal testing the air, gathering courage, before unfolding in full. There is an inherent tension to this moment, the necessary resistance, the trembling anticipation before release, but also the certainty that the process is worth honoring. You may catch yourself looking around, tracing the contours of your environment and its people with new eyes, surprised by the resilience that now colors even the smallest gestures. As this narrative brings you closer to its denouement, the horizon takes on the texture of promise. Threads once unraveled now gently entwine, weaving a tapestry that is no longer defined solely by past hardship. Around you, the atmosphere tinges with expectancy, a sense that the next chapter awaits not as a test, but as an invitation, extending an open hand toward a future shaped by the subtle, yet unbreakable beliefs now stirring within. In the quiet right before the crescendo, you are left gathering the pieces of your story, every lesson, every stumble, every whispered hope, and cradling them as seeds that only now feel ready to be sown. In the gentle hush just before dawn, Andrew stood alone by the riverbank, paint-thick air still clinging to his clothes from another late night in the factory. Behind him, the first rays of sunlight glimmered against the hulls lined up for inspection, physical proof of nights spent wrestling with the impossible, and days fueled by nothing but grit and the barely spoken faith that something better was coming. Each vessel, battered and beautiful, held memories of arguments sparked by exhaustion, of hands burned by welding torches, of jokes passed around greasy mugs of coffee. But now the city, quiet for a moment, seemed to lift its head and breathe, as if to honor all those unrecorded truths forged in shadows. He traced the water's ripples, the surface alive with shifting light, unconsciously echoing the undercurrents of change within himself. For years, Andrew's world had been a ledger, losses weighed against fleeting profits, fear against determined hope. The current, relentless and impartial, threatened to drag him under more than once. Yet somewhere along the line, He understood that salvation would not come from waiting for rescue. It would come from the simple, stubborn act of meeting crisis not with resignation, but with hungry curiosity, of stepping further into the unknown rather than shrinking from it. He remembered the faces of his friends, his children, his workers, each quietly rewriting their own stories page by page, moving from the tight grip of survival to the wild, uncharted territory of possibility. These lessons came not as thunderclaps, but as gentle persuasions, a pause before responding in anger, a willingness to ask a new question, a silent decision to believe in value where others saw only risk. The nature of abundance, Andrew realized, was less about arrival and more about participation, a series of moments when, in the face of silence and uncertainty, a person claims a right to be here, to seek, to contribute, and to receive. It was there, both in the solitude of early morning and in the laughter echoing off factory walls, that the edges of scarcity began to soften, gradually surrendering to something braver and more enduring. Later that afternoon, as he walked through the humming shop floor, Andrew caught Charlotte in the midst of guiding a new hire, her gestures confident, her voice warm and steady. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and between them passed a silent message, one of hard-won trust, of the realization that no one stands alone in the architecture of prosperity. Every person holding a wrench, tallying figures, or mending a torn uniform was proof that true wealth is not a solitary conquest, but a commingling of courage, collaboration, and purpose. Prosperity, it seemed, decided to take root not in abundance of resources, but in abundance of spirit. And perhaps that's the legacy crisis gifts to those willing to engage it fully, not the comfort of guarantees, but a deeper fluency in the language of uncertainty. Here, in the vulnerable act of creation, every hardship contains its quiet invitation to lay down old stories, to imagine anew, and to trust that the very ground of adversity may yield a harvest richer than once dared hope. So as evening settles over the city, factories lit by the golden haze of accomplishment and anticipation, there is an invitation that lingers, open-hearted and unforgettable, to meet the world with eyes trained for possibility, to greet hardship with an ember of imagination, and to carry forward, not the weight of debt, but the grace that comes from finding one's courage at the very threshold of collapse. For in that space, we do not merely endure, we grow into architects of our own abundance, each day forging meaning from the raw elements of adversity, and teaching ourselves, again and again, that even the darkest river can lead home.